Over the last 150 years, approximately 1,500 people have been hanged in the United Kingdom. Many of those desperately protested their innocence.
Could some of these long-standing convictions have been a miscarriage of justice?
There's a question mark over when precisely Frederick Morton was shot.
Barristers Sasha Wass and Jeremy Dean have been investigating these life-changing cases.
He cut off her head, dismembered her, and buried her in a place where he hoped she would never be found.
Representing living relatives, desperate to clear their family name.
The more you read about it, he could have been innocent.
With the help of modern-day experts,
she's been assaulted with a weapon, and there's been more than one blow.
they reassess the evidence.
We have a blood-stained knife. I simply don't understand the logic.
Before submitting their findings to a Crown Court judge.
Your Honour ought to declare the conviction for murder to be unsafe.
Now, as we reunite the barristers and the family members for the first time,
Hello, Gordon.
Hi.
we'll be finding out exactly what happened next.
They were told by the coroner that they had to find him guilty.
Yes.
Was justice served?
It's perfectly conceivable that Judge Radford got it wrong.
And are the unexplained cases finally closed? Today, Jeremy and Sasha are reopening the file on a calculated case of murder in 1911. When 49-year-old spinster Eliza Barrow suddenly dies at her lodgings, suspicion falls upon her landlords, Frederick and Margaret Seddon. But when police learn they stand to inherit her estate, and that she died of arsenic poisoning, the couple would both stand trial for murder.
Well, Sasha, what I find troubling about Frederick Seddon's case is that the prosecution alleged a joint enterprise between him and his wife, Margaret Seddon. The judge withdrew the case against Margaret Seddon at the end of the prosecution evidence, leaving Frederick Seddon to be convicted of murder and hanged.
Frederick Seddon was a classic fraudster, if I may say so. He persuaded Eliza Barrow to part with all her wealth, put it in his name, and as soon as she had done so, he killed her.
Financial motive is an easy thing for the prosecution to allege, Sasha, but I don't think the evidence was there, and I don't find it persuasive in Frederick Seddon's case.
Later, Jeremy and Sasha will meet up with Frederick Seddon's relative, Paul, to find out exactly what has happened since they last met. But first, a look at this sensational case. September 1911. A man called at a North London home where his wealthy cousin, Eliza Barrow, rented a room. He was shocked to learn that she had died just days earlier, after a brief illness. Nothing prepared him, though, for the astonishing realization she'd signed all her assets over to the landlord she'd known for less than a year, Frederick Seddon. When a post-mortem concluded she'd been poisoned, Frederick and his wife Margaret were put on trial for murder. Margaret, however, was sensationally acquitted, the jury finding only Frederick guilty. On the 18th of April 1912 at Pentonville Prison, Frederick Seddon was hanged. Now, Frederick Seddon's relative, Paul, wants justice for a conviction that's haunted his family for a century.
My mother never mentioned it when I was growing up. So maybe something as shameful as this to a proud family was brushed under the carpet and not mentioned over the dinner table. I do hope that he is found innocent, but I think also for my uncles and aunties, it would be important for them to have closure on this.
Seddon's trial was high profile and controversial. The acquittal of his wife Margaret over Frederick's conviction caused shockwaves that continue to reverberate today. But was Seddon's conviction a miscarriage of justice? Paul has travelled to London to meet the barristers who will be re-investigating his relative's case.
Hello, Paul.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Good
Jeremy.
to meet you. Hi.
Hello,
Hi,
Paul.
Sasha.
Sasha, hi. So you've done some investigations of your own. Have you come to a conclusion as to whether the conviction is safe or not?
I certainly haven't come to a conclusion. I've got lots of unanswered questions, and one thing that jumps out at me that a lot of the focus, certainly from the press, was around his arrogance, perceived arrogance, and greed, which aren't crimes.
Is there anything you find particularly concerning about Frederick Seddon's case?
I'm quite intrigued looking at the actual crime and the putting him on the spot as being the one who, without doubt, did it. You know, that is still up in the air for me.
Well, Jeremy and I are going to go away and do some investigations of our own, and I will be keeping a completely open mind. All right, it's very nice to meet you indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been great meeting you.
Sasha and Jeremy are starting their investigation by exploring the key facts surrounding the murder of Eliza Barrow.
At the time of her death, she had been lodging in the house of Frederick Seddon. Shortly before her death, Eliza had made Frederick Seddon the executor to her will. All of her property had been transferred into Frederick Seddon's name. On the 4th of December 1911, Frederick Seddon was arrested. Mrs. Seddon, Margaret Seddon, was also arrested, and they were jointly tried for murder. Margaret was acquitted, and the sentence of death was passed on Frederick.
It's significant that Margaret Seddon was acquitted of murder, having been jointly tried with Frederick Seddon. And we need to look closely at whether indeed she is a realistic alternative suspect for the murder of Eliza Barrow, if indeed Eliza Barrow was murdered at all.
Eliza was born in 1862 into a wealthy family of landowners. She inherited a fortune that included gold, East India trading stock, and property, including a pub and a barber shop. In the summer of 1910, after seeing an advert for a lodger, Eliza moved into the Seddons' mansion. Paul's in North London, meeting with author and case expert Sandra Hempel. He wants an insight into the circumstances around Eliza's death.
Here we have the house itself, the scene of the crime, looking very much as it did at the time, actually. Yes. Quite a large house, but there were quite a few people living there at the time.
Within months of her moving in, Frederick Seddon took a keen interest in Eliza's extensive financial portfolio.
She was terribly keen on money, just like Fred, and they seem to have been soulmates, really, because he eventually got taken on by her as her unofficial financial advisor.
1911 was one of the hottest summers on record, and an increasingly reclusive Eliza fell ill with vomiting and diarrhea.
The conditions in the rooms upstairs were absolutely disgusting because of the nature of Eliza's illness. And the doctor, Dr. Swan, who was visiting her and treating her, said he had never seen so many flies.
The Seddon family addressed the insect infestation in Eliza's living quarters by purchasing flypaper repellent, which was laced with arsenic. Eliza's condition deteriorated, and at 6 a.m. on the 14th of September, she died.
Dr. Swan, without any quibble at all, signed the death certificate, epidemic diarrhea and exhaustion. It wasn't unusual at all for people to go down with sickness and diarrhea at that time.
Despite Miss Barrow's family having a vault in Highgate Cemetery, Seddon buried Eliza in a pauper's grave only 2 days after she died. Within a week, the family of Eliza's cousin, Frank von der Ahe, were on Seddon's doorstep, demanding answers.
When von der Ahe's wife, Julia, asked why the family had not been notified of Eliza's death, Seddon produced a letter saying that he'd been to an address close by, inviting them to the funeral on the 16th. Sasha, this is the letter.
I sincerely regret to have to inform you of the death of your cousin, Miss Eliza Mary Barrow at 6 a.m. this morning from epidemic diarrhoea. The funeral will take place on Saturday next, about 1 to 2 p.m. Of course, no address is given. I must also inform you that she made a will on the 11th of that month, leaving what she died possessed of to Ernest Grant, and appointed myself as sole executor under the will. Jeremy, I'm suggesting that this letter looks to me like a smokescreen. Frank von der Ahe always denied having received the letter.
In my view, whilst it's unfortunate that the von der Ahes never received this letter, I believe the content of this letter is perfectly consistent with Frederick Seddon seeking to relay to the von der Ahes what had happened. There's no evidence that Frederick Seddon was a fundamentally dishonest character. He was respected in life and he gained trust. These are important matters for us to consider.
Frederick Seddon was born in 1872 in Liverpool. He forged a successful career selling door-to-door funeral insurance for the London and Manchester Assurance Company. Hall wants an insight into how Seddon's career could have shaped his character. He's meeting Dr. Liz McFall, an expert in Victorian-era industrial assurance.
Hi, Liz. Hi.
Good to meet you, Paul.
They're at Liverpool's Masonic Hall, where Seddon was once a regional member.
Industrial insurance was sold primarily to the working classes. Really, it was a form of not life insurance, but death insurance to save for their funerals.
So you say death insurance as opposed to life insurance. I've never heard that phrase.
Saving with industrial insurance was a bit like gambling and drinking. It was seen as something that the working classes really shouldn't be doing.
Right.
The moral hazard of insurance, that you take an insurance policy, that is an incentive to kill the person who you've insured. People took insurance policies out on other people, their relatives, distant relatives, their children even, and that those people would either be neglected, not looked after properly in the case of an elderly relative, right, or endangered in some way.
Do you think that the jury and in the court process might have maybe been leaning towards that sort of thinking process when Frederick was in the dock?
There is a good chance that certain members of the jury, at least some members of the jury, would have been quite hostile towards industrial insurance. Yeah, quite. On
the basis that he's asked somebody without the wherewithal to entrust significant amounts of money with him, and a few weeks later, she's not here anymore.
Absolutely, seen him as a bit of a sharp operator.
The trial began on the 4th of March 1912 at the Old Bailey and caused a frenzy. The prosecution zeroed in on the monetary arrangements between Frederick Seddon and the victim, Miss Barrow. Sasha and Jeremy want to scrutinise these financial details. They're meeting forensic accountant Chris Swinson.
Does this represent what Eliza Barrow had before she met Frederick Seddon?
Yes.
In her possession?
Yes. Firstly, in October 1910, the India stock is registered in Seddon's name. And in the same month, he goes to see solicitors to arrange for the transfer of both of the properties.
Yes.
The other transfers happen later. The gold is taken out by Miss Barrow in June 1911.
What financial arrangement was made between Seddon and Eliza Barrow? I mean, what did she get out of this?
She was to be paid an annuity.
Right.
One. Secondly, she was to receive her accommodation rent-free.
Yes.
So, in relation to what you've told us so far, do you find anything surprising about what occurred? Suspicious, sinister, unusual?
In terms of the financial aspects of the transaction, no, not particularly. It seems to me to respond to what would have been perfectly reasonable concerns on her part.
Frederick Seddon was district superintendent at Manchester and London Industrial Assurance Company. From the point of view of a woman such as Miss Barrow, it's perfectly feasible that she might simply feel she could trust him, isn't it?
Yes. The superintendent will be responsible for collecting the cash from his agents, making sure he'd got what was expected, and then paying it into the insurance company. So your point is entirely fair. From Miss Barrow's position, he would have looked like a respectable person in a position of trust.
Yeah, but that is very important, isn't it? Because if there is any question to be raised over her willingness to engage with him in the way you've described, I mean, that scenario may present an answer, mightn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And dispel any basis for believing that he dishonestly lured her into a financial position that may be considered suspicious in some way.
At trial, Seddon claimed Eliza had ingested arsenic herself, with the source of the poison being flypaper insect repellent found in a room. But did the Seddons poison Eliza Barrow with arsenic? After the 12-day trial concluded, a verdict was returned. Margaret Seddon was acquitted of all charges. However, Frederick was sentenced to death. But support for Seddon was significant, with a petition for reprieve generating 300,000 signatures. To examine reaction at the time, Paul and his partner Laura have come to Liverpool Library.
The petition for the reprieve of Seddon, promoted by his Liverpool relatives and friends, is being extensively signed. The Crown should extend its clemency, and that he had proved himself to be a man of high moral character. Does that make you feel like he's innocent?
I don't know. Certainly there's a lot of circumstantial stuff. So Frederick's wife, Margaret, actually wrote to the paper, "I should like the public to know what he said. Maggie," he said, "you know I'm absolutely innocent of this dreadful charge. God is my judge. He knows. There is one thing. You must go down on your hands and knees and thank God that you are spared to look after the children. Bear up, because it will grieve me to know that you are worrying." So they've given up now, haven't they? But it's futile and it's going to happen. I'd love to know more details on the dropping of her charges, because that was fairly soon after the charges were put on both of them.
Hope grew for a last-minute reprieve for Seddon. At appeal, the issue of the poison and its source was explored again. Forensic toxicologist Professor Athol Johnston is reporting his toxicology observations to Sasha and Jeremy.
I want to begin by examining briefly some of the evidence in relation to flypapers.
Well, I was expecting the flypaper to be one of these sticky rolls where the flies get caught on it, but it's not. This is what it looks like, and it's not, actually, that's not far off life size. What it's alleged Mr. Seddon did was dissolve the material out of the flypaper and added it to something that could be drunk. And in this case, we've got a bottle of Valentine's meat juice.
Can I ask you about the question of measurements? Because the ultimate diagnosis in Eliza Barrow's case is that she had ingested 2.01 grains of arsenic. How accurate were measurements back in 1912?
So there's got to be a margin of error on that. Out of one of these, you can get between 2 and 5 grains of arsenic if you could extract it completely. So actually, there's quite enough there to be a fatal dose.
There's no connection between Frederick Seddon and flypapers. The position in this case is very different to a shooting where there's evidence that the defendant fired a gun, or a stabbing where the accused is linked to a knife. So this case requires very close analysis before it can be concluded that Frederick Seddon's conviction is truly safe.
Despite there being no direct link between the poison and Frederick Seddon, his appeal was rejected. On the 18th of April 1912, he was executed at Pentonville Prison in London. Paul and Laura have come to the boundary of the prison. They want to pay their respects on the anniversary of Seddon's death.
Behind that big wall there was a grassed area where executed prisoners were buried, and ironically today is the 107th anniversary of the day he was hanged.
It was such a high-profile case,
Yeah.
and there were so many petitions
Yeah,
from
yeah.
across the country
Yeah.
as well. If he hadn't have been perhaps buried behind those walls, then
Yeah.
there might have been too much attention around a grave.
Yeah. If he has found out that it was a safe conviction, it's still very sad. They've still got the circumstances of those poor kids seeing, you know, their whole life turned upside down. Guilty or not guilty doesn't take away the effect that it's had on them and Eliza and little Ernest.
With Judgment Day imminent, Jeremy's been re-examining the unexpected acquittal of Frederick's wife, Margaret Seddon.
Margaret Seddon was involved in the cashing of cheques before the death of Eliza. Margaret Seddon, often used a false name and a false address, so she's implicated there in dishonest activities.
It was Frederick Seddon who arranged the transactions to do with property. It may well have been that he asked his wife to cash those cheques, and she did so in a false name, but that only reinforces the fact that these financial transactions were fraudulent and criminal. Margaret Seddon plays a very secondary role to this.
After Frederick Seddon was hanged, Margaret Seddon, who made a blanket denial of any knowledge at the trial, came out publicly and she said that she had seen Frederick Seddon give Miss Barrow arsenic and that he threatened to kill her with a revolver if she gave him a win. And then on the 12th of December 1912, having quickly remarried, almost as soon as Frederick Seddon had been executed on the gallows, Margaret Seddon emigrates to the United States with their children.
If he was innocent, if he didn't do it, then what a terrible thing to happen to that family, that they've been torn apart and all changed unjustly.
Sasha and Jeremy have completed their investigation and must now put their submissions to Judge David Radford.
The case comprised a strong motive, strong evidence of poison, and strong evidence that Frederick Seddon tried to cover it all up.
Frederick Seddon was convicted on highly circumstantial evidence. His wife Margaret was found not guilty. I'll be looking at that aspect of it. It's difficult to see how the jury found one to be guilty and the other not.
For Paul, today is the culmination of his family's fight for justice that began over a century ago.
Hello, Paul.
Hi,
Nice
Sasha.
to see
Hi.
you again.
Hello, Paul.
Hi,
Good to see
Jeremy.
you.
Hi.
What we need to stress is the judge is very thorough. He looked at all the material. So let's see how it goes.
Please sit down. We are here today for me to consider, with the assistance of learned counsel, the safety of the conviction for murder of Frederick Henry Seddon. Please, if you would like, Mr. Dean, to amplify what you've already put in front of me in
Thank
writing.
you. Mr. Seddon was arrested at about 7 p.m. on the 4th of December, 1911. This is what Mr. Seddon said. Absurd. What a terrible charge. Willful murder. Are you going to arrest my wife as well? Now, from the outset, Mr. Seddon denied having poisoned Eliza Barrow. And it's not by coincidence that he mentioned his wife. The acquittal of Margaret Seddon is difficult to understand when stood against the conviction of Frederick Seddon. The central point relates to evidence given in the course of our inquiry from a modern-day forensic accountant, Chris Swinson. And essentially what Mr. Swinson said was that the financial aspect of this case was not suspicious and that it could not possibly be said that this provided a motive for Frederick Seddon. And once the issue of motive is removed from the equation, then there was realistically no sufficient case against Frederick Seddon, and the time has come to declare Frederick Seddon's conviction for the murder of Eliza Barrow unsafe.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. I'm grateful to you. Miss Wass.
Your Honour, the motive for the murder of Eliza Barrow was and remains one of money. Eliza Barrow had known Frederick Seddon for a very short period of time. This was not a family relationship. The upshot of the financial transaction orchestrated by Frederick Seddon was that the boy whom Eliza Barrow was careful and keen to look after,
That's Ernest.
Ernest Grant, was left with nothing. Frederick Seddon made a rapid arrangement for an unceremonious funeral in a pauper's grave, at which none of Eliza Barrow's family attended. The clear evidence that was before the jury was that Frederick Seddon attempted to dispose of Eliza Barrow's body before any questions could be asked. Professor Athol Johnston, a forensic toxicologist, validated the findings of the trial pathologist. Large quantities of arsenic were found, which would have been enough for a fatal dose. So contrary to what Mr. Dean has submitted, this case should cause you no doubt in terms of the safety of the conviction.
Yes, thank you. I shall reflect on those oral submissions.
Thank you.
If you're kind enough to leave so I can do that.
Has Jeremy done enough to question the conviction? Did Frederick Seddon poison Eliza Barrow with arsenic? Or was he the victim of an unfair trial? The judge is now ready to deliver his verdict.
One of the matters which particularly has attracted attention is one of motive. Mr. Dean has stressed in his submissions the evidence of the financial arrangements. The point has been made that the arrangements, although informal, were not inherently fraudulent or dishonest. With great respect to Mr. Swinson, could not possibly begin to suggest that that undermines the safety of the conviction. In my view, there is no reason to believe there was anything unfair in the trial, and there was nothing, in my judgment now, to believe that the verdict was unsafe. I'm grateful. I shall rise.
Today, having reviewed the facts of the case, do Jeremy and Sasha agree with Judge Radford's verdict?
Jeremy, I wasn't at all surprised that Judge Radford found the Seddon conviction to be safe. The suggestion that his wife was responsible really wasn't borne out by the evidence.
It's troubling that the case was withdrawn against his wife and he was left in what was clearly said to be a joint enterprise. But I'll be really quite interested to see what lines of inquiry Paul has been pursuing since Judge Radford gave his decision.
Paul has returned to London to meet the barristers for the first time since the judgment.
I'm still in doubt as to whether Frederick Seddon actually did the crime and whether Margaret Seddon didn't have anything to do with it. So with the extra information that I've sort of found out, it'd be interesting to see whether Jeremy and Sasha were happy with that judgment as I wasn't.
Hello, Paul.
Hi.
Good to see you.
You too.
Nice
Hi,
to see you
Sasha.
again.
Hi.
Come and sit down.
Well, thank you very much for coming. The judge's decision in the case of Frederick Seddon was one I found disappointing. But tell us, how do you feel about the judge's decision?
The evidence that I heard didn't really give me that conviction that, yes, it had to be him, to the point that he was found guilty and Margaret acquitted.
Yeah.
Either he poisoned her or she poisoned her, or they did it together. Those are really the only viable options. Would you agree?
I don't think there was any collusion between them. So I do feel that it was one or the other.
Right.
But there was no overwhelming sense that it was Frederick who did it.
Have you been taking further action in relation to Frederick Seddon's case?
What I was curious about is the destiny of Margaret and the children who went to America. Subsequently, I was contacted by an ancestor of Margaret Seddon, Paul Holford, who provided me with some fascinating information.
Paul made the short trip to Everton to meet a newly discovered relation of Margaret Seddon, Paul Holford.
Paul has said that he has got links to Margaret Seddon and information about her, so I'm really looking forward to what that might be.
They met at a special location, St George's Church, Everton.
Hi, Paul.
Hello, Paul. Nice to meet you.
Where in 1893, Margaret married Frederick Seddon.
This is a marriage certificate of them at this church. You can see there, Frederick was 21 and Margaret was 18. And they'd actually lived in the same street. My brother David, unfortunately, passed away last year, done a lot of research into our family. This is a photograph of my mother with my brother David.
Yeah.
This is Margaret Seddon Jr., as I refer to her.
Yeah.
That is her mother, Margaret Seddon Sr., and that is your great-great-great-uncle.
Yeah.
And we think there's a great family resemblance to photographs of that side of the family.
Yeah, it's uncanny. I think it's great that a distant relative of mine from the other side of the family is here and is aware of this case. One of the things that I held right through the actual programme was what happened to Margaret and the children. Obviously, I know that they went to America.
Could Paul reveal anything about Margaret Seddon's life after Frederick's execution?
I can tell you a little bit more what happened to Margaret. Oh, two censuses here. This is the census of the United States for Rhode Island in County of Providence for 1920. There's James and Margaret there. There they've had 3 children. One of them they called Margaret as well. And there's 2 children by Frederick Seddon, but there's no sign of Margaret Jr. 10 years later, here they are again. Exactly the same name, same place. Haven't moved, they settled there. Again, no sign of Margaret.
But around the time of the case, Maggie, young Margaret, was 16, so maybe she was ready to go into service or you know, start living her own life after the horrible events.
So, I mean, research by my family shows that Margaret Jr. never went to America.
No.
What would Margaret Seddon's relations make of Paul's suspicion that it was she who poisoned Eliza?
Pretty much straight after the trial and Frederick's hanging, Margaret had remarried and took at least 2 of the children over to America. It raised my suspicions of Margaret and made me think, was she running away from something?
I can tell you a story that my late brother used to tell us years ago. About 1965, my brother visited my maternal grandmother and there was a lady in the house, Margaret Seddon Jr. And in the course of the conversation she was having with my brother, she suddenly said, "Did you know my dad was a killer, Frederick Seddon?" And then she came out with, "And I'm the one that went down the road and bought the flypapers."
Right.
My maternal grandmother stopped the conversation stone dead there, saying, "He doesn't want to know about that."
There's certainly a murderer in our family background, but which one of our family members did it?
From our side of the family, our perspective and our knowledge of it is that he was the killer.
To be honest with you, I still have my doubts.
So, Paul, that is an interesting story, but I think we've all got to be terribly cautious about what we hear people say who've been told something else, because we simply don't know how they were given that information, who gave them the information, why they may have had a motive to plant information which could not have been true necessarily.
Maggie's sort of account of what happened didn't really change my view at all, and I thought, well, let's do a bit more digging. So I contacted John Edelston. He knew a lot about the Seddon trial.
Paul met up with crime writer and case expert John Edelston back at the scene of the crime in London.
Hello, John.
Paul, I presume.
Yes.
Pleased to meet you, sir. Right, you want to know more about what happened in this very house, 1911,
Yes, I
1912.
do, yeah. What are your thoughts on it?
There are 2 bits of information that I think, at the trial, the defence didn't jump on.
Okay.
And if we look at those 2 specifically,
yeah,
I think you'll agree that the wrong person faced that execution as rope.
Right.
John has concerns about the prosecution's suggested motive. the financial agreement between Eliza Barrow and Frederick Seddon.
So, the first documents refer to the annuity,
Okay.
the so-called motive for the murder. She had two properties that she sold over. One was a public house, very much like the one we're in now, of course, and next door to it, the barber's shop. And they paid her a combined rent of £155 a year. He was painted as a greedy man who'd stolen her property, and then the sooner she's dead, the better. She wasn't cajoled into signing over the properties. She was the one who instigated it.
Yeah.
The solicitors who dealt with it said that she'd written to them a number of times she wanted this annuity, because that income is then protected.
She's got herself a guarantee, so
exactly.
She's the shrewd one.
She's the
by all
shrewd one.
accounts.
And her income has dropped by just over £3 a year, and Frederick's making a profit.
Yeah.
He's got no reason to want her dead.
Right.
Right, next, we will look at the motive for someone else in that house.
The medical evidence at trial was that Eliza Barrow died from a single fatal dose of arsenic, administered within 2 days of her death. Who does John believe administered the fatal dose?
At the trial itself, Margaret said that she had bought 4 packets of flypapers on either the 4th or 5th of September. Margaret's bought the flypapers. That's certainly enough to soak off a fatal dose.
Yeah.
Margaret is the one who takes care of Miss Seddon, whether she's ill or not. I've got a guest here who is not paying any rent anymore because my husband has arranged all the property in his name now and he's paying an annuity. I'm getting nothing out of this, and I'm having to look after a cantankerous, sick woman, and there's no reward for me. What he said at the trial, when trying to explain away the poisoning, was she must have drunk it by accident. Well, that's nonsense. She's not a stupid woman. She wouldn't reach over, pick up a bowl that's got flypapers and have a drink.
Yeah. But what this says to me, John, is that if Frederick Seddon was convinced that he didn't do it, as he said in a trial, he didn't think she'd done it.
It can't have been an accident. She wasn't an idiot, Miss Barrow. My opinion is, knowing what I know now, Frederick was certainly innocent. Margaret was possibly guilty.
Well, that's certainly interesting to hear his opinion. Do you agree with it?
With respect to John, not all of it. However, in some of the aspects of Margaret's role in it all did confirm my doubts as to which of the two ultimately was responsible.
The truth is, none of us will ever know, but listening to you just reinforces for me that it was a circumstantial case and that there's still doubt.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Paul, have you been able to find out any other information?
John obviously mentioned that Frederick and Margaret were defended by Marshall Hall, who was an eminent, as I'm sure you'll know, defence barrister of the day. So I contacted Sally Smith, QC, who actually wrote the biography of Marshall Hall.
Yes.
Paul met Sally at her chambers in London, keen to know whether Sir Edward Marshall Hall could have saved Frederick from the gallows.
Hello, Paul. Nice to meet you. Come on in.
I know you're a bit of an expert on Marshall Hall, who was a huge character in this case. Can you tell me a little bit more about it?
Yes, of course. From about 1907 onwards, he'd become the biggest name at the criminal bar. And the newspapers loved him, and the public loved him, and perhaps most to the point, juries loved him. So all in all, he'd gained this unassailable reputation. It's generally thought that if the case had ended at the end of the prosecution case, there wasn't enough evidence to convict and Mr. Seddon would have been acquitted. But Mr. Seddon had insisted since the beginning that he was going to give evidence on his own behalf. And at the end of the prosecution case, Marshall Hall got up out of the barrister's row in the Old Bailey, went over to the dock where Seddon was standing and said to him, "If you go into the witness box, I can't guarantee you won't hang." And Mr. Seddon said that's what he wanted to do. Frederick Seddon came over, I'm afraid, as a very cold, very logical, very unemotional, mean man who was far too interested in money. And Mrs. Seddon came over as a sad, frightened, bewildered woman, very distressed by the death of the lodger. And that really was the contrast between them, was their performances, if you like to use that word, in the witness box.
Since she first wrote about the case, Sally has come across new information. A cache of letters written by young Maggie Seddon.
The letter that I'm looking at was written between the trial and when her father was hanged, and she was still campaigning, in effect, to get the conviction overturned. She refers to my poor father and my dear father, and she insists again, as she did in court, that she never knew anything about the buying of the arsenic. And also enclosed in the same papers was the card for Frederick Seddon's memorial service. This is from Mrs. Seddon, Mrs. Margaret Seddon. It's in loving memory of my dearly beloved husband, Frederick Seddon, and that shows that the family were still a devoted family, sticking together.
It's fascinating that sort of the loyalty that Margaret and Maggie are showing towards him sort of remained.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Frederick Seddon felt he could do better. That's not an uncommon scenario. Quite often, if not always, when people ignore lawyers' advice, they take the consequences. But for me, everything you're hearing and everything you've been told just underpins how circumstantial a case this was. And that is, I think, the root concern in Frederick Seddon's case. What impact has all of this had on your state of mind?
I mean, you're right. The information that I've found out has just confirmed my doubt and possibly a little bit more suspicion towards Margaret. But yeah, it is just a doubt. And
a doubtful mind in relation to someone's conviction for murder when they've been hanged is one that, you know, triggers anxiety. But you've certainly been working hard in gathering information. Sasha and I applaud you for that. So far as you're concerned, is it case closed?
it is, unfortunately. It's sort of there's nothing more that we can do to establish the actual culprit. So yeah, it is closed.
Well, it may be case closed, but you've certainly made a huge effort to keep it open. It's been great seeing you again, and thanks for all this fascinating information.
Thank you. Cheers.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Very nice.
I think, to a degree, we were all in agreement that there is still doubt, and we'll never know who actually did it. So I was pleased that I'm not here on my own saying I'm not happy with the way it went. We really won't ever know, you know, who actually did that terrible thing to Eliza.